The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the Blue Ridge Mountains when Duke Harrison Blackwood's carriage rolled to an unexpected stop on the dusty road leading to Richmond. His coachman's voice called back with obvious confusion. "Your Grace, there appears to be someone in distress ahead." Harrison pushed aside the velvet curtain and peered through the window, expecting to see the usual roadside beggar or broken wagon wheel. Instead, his breath caught in his throat at a sight that sent shockwards through his carefully controlled world. A young woman sat beneath an oak tree beside a small creek, cradling a baby in her arms. Her blonde hair caught the morning sunlight like spun gold, and even from a distance Harrison could see the exhaustion in her posture, the desperate way she held the child. But it wasn't her beauty that made his hands tremble on the carriage door. It was recognition. "Sophia," he breathed, the name escaping his lips like a prayer and a curse combined. Harrison hadn't seen Sophia Mitchell in over 2 years, not since the night everything between them had ended in scandal, betrayal, and words that could never be taken back. She had disappeared from Virginia society as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving him to marry the woman his family had chosen and live the life that duty demanded. Now here she was, sitting by the roadside like a refugee, holding a baby that couldn't be more than 18 months old, a baby born exactly the right amount of time after their last night together. "Your Grace." The coachman's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Shall we proceed?" Harrison felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he stepped down from the carriage. Every instinct told him to climb back inside, to order the driver to continue to Richmond, to pretend he'd never seen this moment. But his feet carried him forward across the grass, drawn by a magnetic pull he'd never been able to resist when it came to Sophia Mitchell. She looked up at his approach, and Harrison saw her blue eyes widen with shock, fear, and something else. A fierce protectiveness as she clutched the baby closer to her chest. "Harrison," her voice was barely a whisper. "Sophia." He stopped 10 feet away, afraid that coming closer would somehow make this moment more real than he could bear. "What are you doing here?" "Traveling. Passing through." Her answers were clipped, careful. "Traveling where?" "Away." Harrison's gaze shifted to the child in her arms, and his world tilted completely off its axis. The baby was beautiful, blonde curls like his mother, delicate features that promised to be stunning. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They were Harrison's own shade of emerald green, bright and intelligent, and unmistakably Blackwood. "Sophia." Harrison's voice was rough with emotion he couldn't control. "Who is the father?" The question hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Sophia's chin lifted with the stubborn pride he remembered so well. "That's none of your concern, Your Grace." "Your Grace?" Harrison stepped closer, ignoring her obvious desire for distance. "When did you start calling me that, Sophie?" "When you married Lady Catherine Pemberton 3 weeks after telling me you loved me." The words hit him like physical blows. "Sophie, that marriage, it's complicated. My family, the debts, the obligations, are none of my concern." She stood gracefully despite the exhaustion he could see in every line of her body. "Just as my child is none of yours." "Your child?" Harrison's eyes were fixed on the baby, who was staring back at him with uncanny intelligence. "What's the child's name?" "William." The name escaped her lips before she could stop it. William, Harrison's middle name, the name his father had carried, the name that had been passed down through Blackwood men for 6 generations. "Sophie, look me in the eyes and tell me this child isn't mine." For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face. Fear, longing, the ghost of the love they'd once shared. Then her expression hardened into armor he'd never seen her wear. "William is my son, mine alone. He has no father." "That's impossible, and you know it." "Is it?" "Because from where I'm standing, a father is someone who chooses to be present, who protects and provides and loves unconditionally." Sophie's voice grew stronger, more fierce. "A father doesn't abandon the woman carrying his child to marry someone else for political convenience." Harrison felt the accusation like a knife between his ribs. "I didn't know. Sophie, I swear to you, I had no idea you were pregnant when When you what? When you announced your engagement to the woman your family preferred. When you chose duty over love. When I made the biggest mistake of my life." The admission hung in the morning air between them, raw and honest and too late. Little William chose that moment to reach out with one tiny hand toward Harrison, his green eyes bright with curiosity. The gesture was so innocent, so trusting, that Harrison felt his careful composure cracking completely. May I hold him?" "No." Sophie's refusal was immediate and final. You may not. Sophie, please. If he's mine, he's not yours. You gave up any claim to him when you chose Lady Catherine's dowry over our future. Harrison stared at this woman he'd loved more than his own life, holding a child who was clearly his son, and realized he was facing a moment that would define the rest of his existence. What do you want from me, Sophie? Money? Protection? A place to live? I want nothing from you. Her voice was steady, but Harrison could see tears threatening in her crystal blue eyes. I want you to get back in your carriage and drive away. I want you to forget you saw us here. I want you to go back to your perfect life and your perfect wife and leave us alone. I can't do that. You can. You did it once before. Not this time. Harrison's voice grew stronger, more determined. Not when I know about William. Not when I can see myself in his face. Harrison, please. Now Sophie's composure was starting to crack. You don't understand what you're asking. What this would cost. Cost. Sophie, that's my son. My child. Do you really think I care what it costs? Your marriage, your reputation, your family's standing, everything you sacrificed me for in the first place. Harrison looked at the woman he'd never stopped loving, and the child he'd never known existed, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. Then maybe, he said quietly, it's time I learned what really matters. As Sophie stared at him with a mixture of hope and terror, neither of them noticed the second carriage approaching from the direction of Richmond, a carriage bearing the Pemberton family crest. Lady Catherine had come looking for her absent husband, and she was about to discover why the Duke of Blackwood had never been able to love her the way a husband should. The sound of approaching wheels on gravel made both Harrison and Sophia freeze. Through the morning mist, the elegant Pemberton carriage emerged like an omen of disaster, its polished black surface and silver trim reflecting the early sunlight with aristocratic perfection. Oh God, Sophia breathed, instinctively backing toward the creek. Harrison, you need to leave now. No. Harrison's voice was firm as he positioned himself between Sophia and the approaching carriage. I'm not running anymore. The carriage rolled to a stop with military precision. Lady Catherine Pemberton stepped down with graceful authority, her emerald silk traveling dress immaculate despite the early hour. She was undeniably beautiful, golden blonde hair perfectly arranged, porcelain features, and ice blue eyes that missed nothing. Harrison, darling, Catherine's voice carried across the clearing like crystal breaking. Whatever are you doing, stopped by the roadside? Harrison felt Sophia tense behind him, heard the soft rustling as she adjusted William's blanket to better conceal his face. Catherine, I wasn't expecting you on the Richmond road this morning. Father received word that you'd left Blackwood Hall unexpectedly. I was concerned something might be wrong. Catherine's gaze moved past Harrison to Sophia with calculating interest, and it seems I was correct to be concerned. Sophia stepped forward slightly, her chin raised with dignity that hadn't been dimmed by 2 years of hardship. Your Grace, she said with a perfect curtsy, addressing Catherine with the respect due to a duchess. Catherine's eyes narrowed as she studied Sophia's face. Do we know each other, miss? We've met, Your Grace. I'm Sophia Mitchell. I used to attend some of the same social functions before. Sophia's voice trailed off diplomatically. Before? Catherine's tone had grown dangerously sweet. Before my father's financial difficulties required me to seek employment elsewhere. Harrison watched this exchange with growing dread. Catherine was intelligent, observant, and ruthlessly protective of her social position. It would only be a matter of time before she noticed. What a charming child, Catherine said suddenly, her gaze fixing on the bundle in Sophia's arms. May I see the little one? He's sleeping, Sophia said quickly. I wouldn't want to disturb him. Nonsense, children are so delightful when they're small. Catherine stepped closer with predatory grace. I do hope to have children of my own soon. The pointed comment hit its target. Harrison saw Sophia flinch slightly, though she held her composure. Catherine, Harrison interrupted, Miss Mitchell is traveling, and we're delaying her journey. Am I? Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. How thoughtless of me. But surely a few more moments won't matter. I'm quite curious about this child. Before Sophia could protest, Catherine had moved close enough to peer into William's blanket. The moment her eyes found the baby's face, Harrison saw her expression change from mild curiosity to shocked recognition. William was awake now, his bright green eyes staring up at Catherine with innocent interest. There was no mistaking those eyes. They were Harrison's exactly, down to the unusual flecks of gold around the iris. My, Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. What remarkable eyes he has. Sophia clutched William closer, but it was too late. The truth was written across the baby's features for anyone who knew Harrison well enough to see it. "Yes," Sophia said steadily. "He has his father's eyes." "And who might his father be?" Catherine's question was silk wrapped around steel. Sophia looked directly at Harrison, her blue eyes blazing with something between defiance and desperation. "A man who made his choices long ago, a man who has moved on to other obligations." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison could hear his own heartbeat, the creek babbling nearby, a bird singing somewhere in the oak tree. But between the three adults, not a word was spoken. Finally, Catherine straightened to her full height, every inch the imperious duchess. "Miss Mitchell, this is a rather awkward situation. Your Grace, you see, if this child truly has my husband's eyes, that would make him significant to our family's interests." Harrison felt ice form in his stomach. "Catherine, no, darling, let me finish." Catherine's voice remained perfectly controlled. "Miss Mitchell, you present us with quite a dilemma. If this child is Harrison's son, and those eyes suggest he very well might be, then he represents a threat to any legitimate heirs Harrison and I might produce." Sophia's face went white. "I'm not asking for anything. I told Harrison we want nothing from him. Perhaps not now, but children grow up, Miss Mitchell. They ask questions about their fathers. They develop expectations." Catherine's smile was cold as winter. It would be so much simpler if there were no questions to ask. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Harrison stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "Catherine, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I'm suggesting that Miss Mitchell might find life more comfortable elsewhere, far from Virginia, perhaps with enough financial support to ensure she never feels compelled to return or make inconvenient claims." "You want to buy us off," Sophia said flatly. "I want to solve a problem before it becomes unsolvable. And if I refuse," Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes, "then we would have to explore other solutions." Harrison felt rage building in his chest like a storm. "Catherine, you will not threaten them." "Threaten? Harrison, you mistake my meaning entirely. I'm offering Miss Mitchell an opportunity to secure her child's future. $5,000 is more than generous for a woman in her circumstances." "What if I told you the child isn't Harrison's?" Sophia said suddenly. Catherine studied her face carefully. "Then I would ask why you haven't denied it directly, why you allow the implication to stand, why the child bears such a striking resemblance to my husband." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. "Because," she said finally, "I was foolish enough to love your husband once, and because this child deserves to know that love existed, even if it couldn't last." The honesty of her answer hung between them like a confession. "How touching," Catherine said dryly. "But love doesn't solve practical problems, Miss Mitchell. Money does." She gestured to her footman, who approached with a leather portfolio. $5,000, Miss Mitchell. Enough to start a new life anywhere you choose. All you need to do is sign an agreement that you will never contact my husband again, never make claims on behalf of the child, and never return to Virginia." "And if I don't sign?" Catherine's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the calculating woman beneath. "Then I will make your life very difficult indeed. I have resources, Miss Mitchell. Influence. I can ensure that no respectable family will employ you, that no decent boarding house will take you in, that you and your child find yourselves with very few options indeed." Harrison watched Sophia consider the offer, saw the exhaustion and fear in her eyes warring with her natural pride. "Harrison," Sophia said quietly, not looking at him, "what would you have me do?" The question was simple, but Harrison understood its weight. She was asking him to choose, really choose, between the life he'd built and the life he'd lost. "I would have you," Harrison said clearly. "Stay." Catherine's intake of breath was sharp and audible. "Harrison," she said warningly, "think carefully about what you're saying." "I have thought carefully. For 2 years, I've thought of nothing else." Harrison moved to stand beside Sophia, his intention unmistakable. "Catherine, our marriage was arranged for political and financial reasons. You know it, I know it, and both our families know it. It's still a legal marriage, built on a foundation of mutual convenience, not love. And you think that matters? Harrison, you have obligations. To me, to our families, to society." Harrison looked down at William, who was staring up at him with those unmistakable Blackwood eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do have obligations. To my son." The admission shattered the morning silence like a gunshot. Catherine staggered backward as if she'd been struck. "Your son? My son?" Harrison repeated, reaching out to touch William's tiny hand. My child with the woman I should have married 2 years ago. As Catherine's face transformed from shock to fury, to something much more dangerous, Sophia realized that their moment of truth had just made enemies of one of the most powerful families in Virginia, and that sometimes choosing love meant choosing war. Catherine's scream of rage shattered the morning tranquility like breaking glass. You cannot be serious. Harrison, you would acknowledge a bastard child over your legitimate marriage? I would acknowledge my son, Harrison said firmly, his hand still resting on William's tiny fist. And I would acknowledge the woman I should have had the courage to marry in the first place. Should have married? Catherine's voice rose to a near shriek. Harrison, we are already married. You cannot simply decide to undo 2 years of legal union because you've discovered an old paramour with a convenient child. Sophia stepped back, clutching William closer to her chest. Harrison, perhaps we should... No. Harrison's voice was steel. No more running, no more hiding, no more pretending this situation doesn't exist. Catherine began pacing back and forth like a caged predator, her elegant composure completely shattered. This is insane. Harrison, think about what you're saying. Our families have invested everything in this alliance. Your political career, the estate debts, the shipping contracts, all of it depends on our marriage remaining stable. Then perhaps, Harrison said quietly, it's time I learned to live without those things. You're willing to lose everything. Your title, your inheritance, your standing in society. For what? For a servant girl and her bastard? The insult hit Sophia like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Harrison's voice cut through the air with deadly precision. Catherine, you will never speak of them that way again. Or what? You'll divorce me. Harrison, you can't divorce me. The scandal would destroy both our families. Perhaps some things deserve to be destroyed if they're built on lies. Catherine stared at her husband, as if seeing him for the first time. You've lost your mind. This infatuation has completely clouded your judgment. Has it? Or have I finally found my judgment after 2 years of living a lie? Catherine's eyes narrowed dangerously. If you think you can simply cast me aside for this woman, you're gravely mistaken. I won't allow it. You won't allow it? I am Catherine Pemberton Blackwood, Duchess of Blackwood. I have spent 2 years building our reputation, managing our social connections, preparing for the children we would have together. I will not be discarded like an inconvenient contract. She turned to Sophia with venom in her ice-blue eyes. And you, Miss Mitchell, you think you've won some kind of victory here? You think Harrison's moment of romantic delusion means anything in the real world? Sophia lifted her chin, meeting Catherine's gaze steadily. I think Harrison is finally being honest about what he wants. What he wants doesn't matter. What matters is what society will accept, what the law recognizes, what his family can afford to acknowledge. Catherine's voice grew more shrill. You are nobody, Miss Mitchell. A fallen woman with an illegitimate child. You have no fortune, no connections, no legal standing whatsoever. She has my love, Harrison said simply. That's worth more than any of those things. Love? Catherine laughed bitterly. Harrison, love doesn't pay debts. Love doesn't maintain political alliances. Love doesn't secure the future of great families. Then maybe great families need to find better ways to secure their futures. Catherine stared at him for a long moment. Then her expression shifted to something calculating and dangerous. Very well, Harrison. If you insist on pursuing this madness, let me explain what will happen. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. First, I will return to Richmond and inform both our families of this development. I will ensure that every detail of Miss Mitchell's condition becomes public knowledge. The illegitimate child, the abandoned woman, your betrayal of our marriage vows. Harrison felt ice forming in his stomach. Second, I will invoke every legal remedy available to me as your wronged wife. Adultery, abandonment, breach of contract. I will ensure that any attempt to dissolve our marriage costs you everything. Your title, your estates, your inheritance. Catherine, third, she continued relentlessly, I will make certain that Miss Mitchell and her child become social pariahs throughout Virginia and beyond. No respectable employment, no decent housing, no acceptance anywhere civilized society holds sway. Sophia went white, understanding the full scope of what Catherine was threatening. And finally, Catherine's smile was cold as death. I will ensure that this child is never recognized as legitimate by anyone who matters. He will grow up knowing he is a bastard, knowing his father chose momentary passion over honor and responsibility. The threats hung in the air like poison. You're bluffing, Harrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Harrison, I have spent 2 years learning exactly how much power comes with being a duchess. I know which judges owe my father favors, which politicians depend on our family's support, which society matrons control access to respectability. Catherine gestured toward her carriage, where her footman waited with obvious discomfort. I can destroy her, Harrison, completely and utterly. Is your moment of romantic heroism worth condemning the woman you claim to love to a life of absolute ruin? Harrison looked at Sophia, seeing the fear in her crystal blue eyes, the way she held William protectively against her chest. Sophie, he said softly, what do you want me to do? It was the same question she'd asked him, but now the stakes were impossibly higher. Sophia studied his face for a long moment, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with warring with the Duke, who had been trained to consider consequences above all else. I want, she said slowly, what I've always wanted, for you to choose freely, without coercion or manipulation. Sophie, but Harrison, I also want you to understand what Catherine is offering you. She's not offering me anything. She's threatening us. Is she? Or is she offering you a way to keep your life, your responsibilities, your ability to do good in the world? Sophia's voice was steady, but Harrison could see the pain behind her composure. If you choose us, you lose everything that makes you who you are. Your political influence, your resources, your ability to help people. I don't care about any of that. I do. Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. Harrison, I won't be the reason you destroy your life's work. I won't have William grow up knowing his father gave up everything for them. Sophie, what are you saying? She looked down at William, who was staring up at his parents with innocent green eyes, completely unaware that his existence had just shattered 3 adult lives. I'm saying Catherine is right about one thing. Love alone isn't enough. Sophie, no. Love needs security, stability, hope for the future. And if choosing us means you have none of those things, Sophia's voice broke slightly, then maybe Catherine's offer isn't as unreasonable as it first seemed. Catherine stepped forward, sensing victory. Miss Mitchell, you're being very wise. Am I? Sophia looked up, her blue eyes blazing with sudden fire. Actually, Your Grace, I think I've been very foolish. How so? I've been assuming this is your choice to make. Sophia shifted William to one arm and reached into her travel bag with the other. But it's not, is it? She withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age but still clearly legible. What is that? Catherine demanded. A marriage certificate, Sophia said calmly, dated 3 years ago, before Harrison married you. Harrison stared at the document in shock. Sophie, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the night you came to me before your engagement to Catherine was announced. The night you said you couldn't live without me, that you would rather die than marry someone else. Sophia's voice grew stronger, more confident. I'm talking about the hand-fasting ceremony we performed in the old chapel ruins, the vows we made before God, even if we didn't make them before the law. Catherine's face had gone white. That can't be legal. Actually, Sophia continued, according to Virginia common law, a hand-fasting ceremony conducted with intent to marry and followed by cohabitation constitutes a legal marriage, especially when there's a witness. What witness? Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. Sophia smiled for the first time that morning, and it was radiant with triumph. Father Mackenzie, who is very much alive, very much willing to testify, and very much interested in ensuring that little William Blackwood receives his proper inheritance. As the implications of Sophia's revelation hit both Harrison and Catherine, the morning air seemed to crackle with electricity. Because if Sophia was legally Harrison's first wife, then Catherine's marriage was invalid, and William wasn't a bastard at all. He was the legitimate heir to the Duchy of Blackwood. The silence following Sophia's revelation was so complete that even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Catherine stared at the document in Sophia's hands, as if it were a serpent poised to strike. You're lying, Catherine whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. A hand-fasting ceremony, it can't be valid after all this time, can't it? Sophia's voice was steady, confident. Harrison, do you remember what Father Mackenzie told us that night? About the old laws, the traditions that preceded formal church ceremonies? Harrison's mind raced back to that desperate night 3 years ago, when he'd been facing the announcement of his engagement to Catherine and couldn't bear the thought of losing Sophia forever. He said, Harrison recalled slowly, that in the eyes of God, intention mattered more than paperwork, that a true marriage was about the commitment of hearts, not the approval of society. And we committed ourselves completely that night, didn't we? Sophia's blue eyes held his steadily. We made vows, Harrison. Sacred vows. Catherine stepped forward, her face twisted with rage and desperation. Even if such a ceremony took place, which I doubt, it would have no legal standing. Harrison's marriage to me has been recognized by the church, by the state, by both our families. Recognized, yes, but not necessarily valid. Sophia carefully returned the document to her bag. Catherine, your marriage to a man who was already married, even if unknowingly, makes you... What's the legal term? A bigamist? Catherine's face went white as parchment. That's not possible. Isn't it? Harrison, when did you first consult with Father Mackenzie about the hand-fasting laws? Harrison felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. 2 weeks before my engagement to Catherine was announced. He gave me a document explaining the legal precedents, the cases where common law marriages had been upheld by Virginia courts. And what did you do with that document? Harrison paused, memory returning with startling clarity. I filed it with my personal papers, with my attorney. The same attorney who handled your marriage contract with Catherine? Yes. Sophia's smile was sad but triumphant. So there would be a legal record of your research into hand-fasting laws, filed weeks before your marriage to Catherine. Documentation that you knew about alternative forms of marriage before you committed to either ceremony. Catherine was backing away from them now, understanding the trap that had been 3 years in the making. This is a conspiracy, she breathed. You planned this. Both of you. You planned to destroy my marriage from the beginning. No, Catherine. Harrison's voice was quiet but firm. We planned to honor a commitment we made in desperation, thinking it might be the only way we could ever be together. But when you announced your engagement to Catherine, Sophia continued, we thought the hand-fasting was meaningless, just a romantic gesture with no legal weight. Then what changed? Catherine demanded. William. Sophia looked down at the baby in her arms. When I realized I was carrying Harrison's child, I consulted Father Mackenzie about my options. That's when he explained that the hand-fasting was more than symbolic. It was legally binding. Why didn't you tell me? Harrison's voice was raw with emotion. Because you had already chosen your path. You were married to Catherine, building the life your family expected. I thought it would be kinder to let you go than to destroy everything you'd worked for. Kinder to whom? Harrison stepped closer to her. Sophie, I've been living a lie for 2 years. Married to a woman I respect but don't love, knowing I'd abandoned the woman who owned my heart. And I've been raising our son alone, knowing that his father was living a life that had no place for us in it. Catherine, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, suddenly stepped forward. Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not conceding that it is, you can't simply nullify 2 years of marriage. Harrison and I have built a life together. We have contracts, obligations, shared assets, all of which, Sophia said gently, would be void if the marriage itself is void. The scandal would be enormous. Both our families would be ruined. Or, Harrison said thoughtfully, both families could work together to handle this situation with discretion and dignity. Catherine stared at him. What do you mean? I mean that nobody benefits from a public scandal. Your family loses face if it comes out that you unknowingly entered a bigamous marriage. My family loses credibility if it's revealed that I concealed a prior marriage. Harrison moved to stand beside Sophia, his intention clear. But if we handle this quietly, a private annulment, a discreet settlement, a story about mutual incompatibility, everyone saves face. And what about me? Catherine's voice was small, vulnerable for the first time. What happens to me in this convenient arrangement? Sophia shifted William to one arm and reached out toward Catherine with surprising gentleness. Catherine, you're beautiful, intelligent, accomplished. You could have any man in Virginia if you chose to pursue happiness instead of merely duty. You think this is about happiness? Catherine's laugh was bitter. Miss Mitchell, I am 26 years old. I have spent 2 years as Harrison's wife, building a reputation, establishing myself in society. If this marriage is dissolved, I become damaged goods. Or, Harrison said quietly, you become a woman free to choose her own future, instead of living one chosen for her by others. Catherine studied his face, seeing sincerity instead of cruelty. You really believe that, don't you? That I could be happy with someone else? I believe you deserve the chance to find out. For a long moment, the 3 adults stood in silence, each contemplating the magnitude of the choices before them. Finally, Catherine straightened her shoulders with regal dignity. If I agree to this arrangement, what would you propose as terms? Harrison and Sophia exchanged glances. Financial security for your transition back to independence, Harrison said. Enough to live comfortably while you decide what kind of life you want to build. And a story that preserves everyone's reputation, Sophia added. Perhaps irreconcilable differences discovered after careful consideration. And in return, Harrison said firmly, Sophia and I marry properly, publicly, with William acknowledged as my legitimate heir. Catherine was quiet for a very long time, studying little William's face. When she looked up, her expression was resigned, but not bitter. He really does have your eyes, she said to Harrison. Even I can see that. Yes. And you love her. More than my own life. And she loves you? Sophia answered for herself. Enough to disappear rather than destroy his life. Enough to raise his child alone rather than force him to choose between love and duty. Catherine nodded slowly. Then perhaps this is for the best. She looked directly at Sophia with something approaching respect. Miss Mitchell, you've outmaneuvered me completely. I came here expecting to eliminate a threat to my marriage, and instead I've discovered that my marriage never existed at all. I'm sorry for the pain this causes you. Are you? I wonder. Catherine's smile held no malice. But I think I might eventually be grateful for it. She turned to Harrison with the dignity of a true duchess. Harrison, our marriage is ending where it began, as a business arrangement. But this time, we're both choosing the terms. Catherine, no regrets, Harrison. We gave each other 2 years of mutual respect and practical partnership. That's more than many arranged marriages achieve. As Catherine walked back toward her carriage, she paused and looked back at the family forming before her eyes. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I hope you're very happy together, all three of you. As her carriage disappeared down the dusty road toward Richmond, Harrison turned to Sophia with wonder in his green eyes. Sophie, is this real? Are we really free? We're free, she confirmed, lifting William so his father could hold him properly for the first time. Finally, completely free. As Harrison cradled his son against his chest, feeling the perfect weight of the child he'd never known existed, he realized that sometimes the most complicated problems had the simplest solutions. All it required was choosing love over fear, truth over convenience, and hope over resignation. And sometimes, the woman you thought you'd lost forever was just waiting for you to be brave enough to find her again. 3 months after the roadside encounter, what should have been the happiest day of Harrison and Sophia's life threatened to become their most dangerous when an unexpected guest arrived at their wedding ceremony, just as they were about to exchange vows. Stop this travesty immediately. The voice boomed through the small Virginia chapel, causing every head to turn toward the figure striding down the aisle with military authority. Lord Pemberton, Catherine's father, approached the altar flanked by 2 men in legal robes and a sheriff. Harrison felt Sophia's hand tremble in his as they stood before the altar, little William sleeping peacefully in the arms of Harrison's sister Margaret in the front pew. Lord Pemberton, Harrison said calmly, though his jaw was tight with tension, what is the meaning of this interruption? The meaning, Blackwood, is that you are about to commit bigamy in front of God and witnesses. Pemberton's face was red with fury as he waved a legal document. My daughter is still your lawful wife. Sophia felt her heart stop. That's impossible. The hand-fasting ceremony was a fantasy concocted by a desperate woman to legitimize her bastard child. Pemberton's voice carried to every corner of the chapel. These gentlemen are legal experts from Richmond. They've examined your so-called evidence. One of the lawyers stepped forward, his expression grave. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Mitchell, the document you claim proves a valid hand-fasting marriage has been thoroughly investigated. Harrison's grip tightened on Sophia's hand. And? Father Mackenzie died 2 weeks ago. Before his death, he provided a signed affidavit stating that while he did perform a ceremony for you both 3 years ago, it was purely symbolic, a blessing, not a legal marriage. The chapel erupted in shocked whispers. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. That's not true, she whispered. Father Mackenzie told me it was legally binding. Perhaps he told you what you wanted to hear. The second lawyer interjected. But according to his final testimony, he specifically warned you that the ceremony held no legal weight under Virginia law. Harrison stared at the legal documents being thrust toward him. You're saying the hand-fasting was meaningless? Completely meaningless, which means your marriage to Lady Catherine remains valid and uncontested. Lord Pemberton's smile was triumphant and cruel. Any attempt to marry Miss Mitchell would constitute bigamy, punishable by imprisonment and the forfeiture of all your assets. Sophia stepped back from the altar, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume in a play that had gone horribly wrong. "I don't understand," she said desperately. "Harrison, Father Mackenzie showed me the legal precedents. Precedents that don't apply to your situation," the first lawyer explained with professional coldness. "The cases you referenced involved couples who cohabitated openly as man and wife for extended periods. You and Mr. Blackwood were together for one night, then separated for 3 years." Harrison felt his carefully rebuilt world crumbling around him. "What exactly are you demanding, Pemberton?" "I'm demanding that you honor your legal marriage to my daughter and cease this charade with your former mistress." Pemberton gestured toward the sheriff. "Sheriff Davies has a warrant for Miss Mitchell's arrest if this ceremony proceeds." "Arrest? On what charges?" "Fraud, conspiracy to commit bigamy, and attempted theft of a noble title for her illegitimate child." The accusations hit Sophia like physical blows. Around the chapel, wedding guests, Harrison's family and friends, began murmuring with shock and embarrassment. "Lord Pemberton," Margaret Blackwood spoke up from the front pew, still holding baby William, "surely this is a family matter that could be resolved privately." "Not when it involves criminal fraud, Lady Margaret." Pemberton's eyes were cold as winter. "Miss Mitchell has deceived your brother about the legitimacy of her child, manipulated him into believing in a false marriage, and attempted to steal inheritance rights that belong to my daughter's future children." Harrison looked at the faces surrounding them, his family's shock, the guests' confusion, the legal authorities' impatience. Then he looked at Sophia, seeing the devastation in her blue eyes as she watched their dreams dissolve. "Sophie," he said quietly, "what do you want to do?" Before she could answer, baby William chose that moment to wake up and begin crying. The sound cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife, reminding everyone present of the innocent life at the center of this adult drama. Sophia looked at her son, their son, and something fierce blazed in her crystal blue eyes. "What I want," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the chapel, "is to tell the truth. All of it." She turned to face Lord Pemberton and his legal team directly. "You're right. The hand-fasting ceremony 3 years ago was symbolic, not legal. Father Mackenzie told me it was legally binding because he was trying to comfort a heartbroken young woman who had just discovered she was pregnant and alone." Harrison stared at her in shock. "Sophie, but you're wrong about one crucial thing," Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger. "William is not illegitimate." "Of course he is," Pemberton scoffed. I just admitted that the hand-fasting wasn't legal, but there was another ceremony, a real one." Sophia reached into her bouquet and withdrew a second document, this one clearly official, with wax seals and formal legal language. "Harrison and I were married by Judge William Thornton in Richmond 14 months ago, immediately after William was born, and I learned that Catherine's marriage to Harrison was invalid." The silence that followed was deafening. "What do you mean, invalid?" the first lawyer demanded. Sophia's smile was radiant with triumph. "I mean that Catherine Pemberton was already married when she wed Harrison." She unfolded the document carefully, revealing an official marriage certificate dated 6 years earlier. Catherine Elizabeth Pemberton married Lord Reginald Ashworth in a private ceremony when she was 19 years old. The marriage was concealed because Lord Ashworth was already engaged to another woman, and they hoped to resolve the situation quietly. Lord Pemberton's face had gone white. That's impossible." "Is it? Lord Ashworth died in a riding accident 2 years ago, leaving behind substantial debts and a scandal his family wanted to avoid. But he also left behind legal records of his marriage to your daughter." Harrison stared at the document, understanding dawning in his green eyes. "Sophie, how did you—" "Judge Thornton was Lord Ashworth's attorney before his death. When I consulted him about William's legitimacy, he recognized Catherine's name and investigated her marital status." Sophia's voice was steady, triumphant. "It seems your wife has been the bigamist all along, Harrison." The chapel erupted in chaos. Guests gasped and whispered. The lawyers huddled together in urgent conversation, and Sheriff Davies looked completely bewildered. Lord Pemberton grabbed the marriage certificate, studying it with growing horror. Even if this is real, it changes nothing. Catherine's marriage to Ashworth was secret, unrecognized, but legally binding." Judge Thornton's voice rang out from the back of the chapel as he entered with his own entourage. "Lord Pemberton, I've been trying to reach you for weeks about this matter." The elderly judge approached the altar with grave dignity. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Mitchell, I apologize for this disruption, but given the accusations being made, I felt it necessary to clarify the legal situation publicly." He faced the assembled crowd with judicial authority. After extensive investigation into the marital history of all parties involved, I can confirm that Catherine Pemberton's marriage to Harrison Blackwood was invalid from the beginning due to her existing marriage to Lord Ashworth. But she didn't know, Lord Pemberton protested weakly. Ignorance doesn't invalidate existing legal bonds, Lord Pemberton. Furthermore, Mr. Blackwood and Miss Mitchell were legally married in my chambers 14 months ago, making their union entirely legitimate. Judge Thornton gestured toward little William, who had stopped crying and was staring around at all the adults with curious green eyes. Young William Blackwood is the legitimate son of a legitimate marriage, with full inheritance rights as the heir to the Duchy of Blackwood. As the legal dust settled and the shocked whispers died down, Harrison turned to Sophia with wonder and admiration in his eyes. "Sophie, when did you plan all this?" "The moment I realized that love wasn't enough, that we needed truth, justice, and legal protection to build a real life together." Her smile was radiant with love and triumph. "I wasn't going to let anyone take our family away from us ever again." Lord Pemberton, defeated and humiliated, gathered his legal team and prepared to leave. "This isn't over," he warned darkly. "Yes, it is," Judge Thornton said firmly. "Lord Pemberton, any further harassment of this family will result in legal action. Your daughter was an innocent party in this deception, but you have no grounds for any claims against Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood." As Pemberton and his men departed, the chapel gradually filled with laughter and celebration. Harrison swept Sophia into his arms as little William gurgled happily from Margaret's protective embrace. "Mrs. Blackwood," Harrison said, kissing his wife thoroughly, "you are the most remarkable woman in Virginia." "Mrs. Blackwood," Sophia corrected with a radiant smile. "I like the sound of that." As their guests erupted in cheers and applause, the Blackwood family, finally legally permanently united, celebrated the victory of love over deception, truth over manipulation, and courage over fear. Some battles, Sophia realized, were won not with weapons but with patience, intelligence, and the determination to protect what mattered most. And sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply refusing to give up on love. 2 years after their tumultuous wedding ceremony, Harrison and Sophia Blackwood had transformed their lives into something neither had dared to dream possible during those desperate early days of secret meetings and stolen moments. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Blackwood Hall's renovated nursery as Sophia stood watching 3-year-old William teach his baby sister Elizabeth how to stack wooden blocks. William had grown into a miniature version of his father, dark hair, emerald eyes, and a determined personality that left no doubt about his Blackwood heritage. "Gentle William," Sophia laughed as he enthusiastically demonstrated block stacking. "Elizabeth is only 8 months old. She's smart, Mama," William declared with the seriousness of a child who had learned early that being smart mattered. "She can do it." Elizabeth, who indeed showed signs of exceptional intelligence, grabbed a block and promptly put it in her mouth instead of on the tower. "Perhaps we'll try again tomorrow," Harrison's voice came from the doorway as he entered, still dressed in his riding clothes from his morning inspection of the estate. Sophia turned to greet her husband, marveling as she did every day at how much he'd changed from the bitter, isolated man she'd first encountered by the roadside. The past 2 years had restored not just his happiness, but his sense of purpose. "How are the new tenants settling in?" she asked, settling baby Elizabeth on her hip. "Better than expected. The Morrison family is grateful for the opportunity to farm the Eastern Acres." Harrison scooped William up, tossing him gently in the air to delighted giggles. "They say they've never had a landlord who actually cared about their success." "That's because you understand what it means to rebuild from nothing." Harrison's smile was soft with memory. He'd used his position and resources to help families displaced by the economic upheavals of the 1850s, turning Blackwood Hall into a model of progressive estate management. "Speaking of rebuilding," Harrison said, "we have visitors arriving this afternoon." "Oh, who?" "Catherine and her new husband." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Catherine is coming here willingly?" "Apparently married life agrees with her. She and Dr. Marcus Webb are traveling to Richmond, and she asked if they could stop to see William and Elizabeth." The relationship between the former rivals had evolved into something unexpected, mutual respect and, surprisingly, genuine friendship. Catherine's marriage to the kind, brilliant physician had transformed her from a calculating society woman into someone who had found her own version of happiness. That afternoon, the Blackwood family gathered on the front veranda to welcome their guests. Catherine Webb stepped down from the carriage, looking genuinely radiant, her ice-blue eyes warm with contentment, her smile reaching her heart instead of stopping at her lips. "Harrison, Sophia!" Catherine embraced them both warmly, then knelt to William's level. "And look how big you've gotten, Master William." "Aunt Catherine!" William threw his arms around her with the unself-conscious affection of a child who had known only love and acceptance. Dr. Webb, a distinguished man with graying temples and kind eyes, approached with obvious happiness. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for receiving us. Catherine has spoken of your family so often." "All good things, I hope," Sophia said with a teasing smile. "Only the truth," Catherine replied, taking Elizabeth from Sophia's arms, "that you've built something beautiful together." As they settled on the veranda with tea and conversation, Catherine's transformation was evident in every gesture. Gone was the sharp-edged woman who had threatened and manipulated. In her place was someone who had learned to value love over status, happiness over security. "Catherine," Harrison said during a lull in conversation, "you look genuinely happy." "I am." Catherine glanced at her husband with obvious affection. "Marcus helped me understand that being loved for who I am is infinitely better than being married for what I represent." "It took courage to start over," Sophia observed. "It took desperation," Catherine corrected with a laugh. "After our marriage was annulled, I thought my life was over. No prospects, damaged reputation, family scandals. But Marcus saw past all of that." Dr. Webb took his wife's hand gently. "I saw a brilliant, accomplished woman who had been trapped in other people's expectations, rather like a patient who needed healing instead of judgment." "And what was the cure?" Harrison asked with genuine interest. "Permission to be herself," Dr. Webb replied simply. "Catherine is remarkable when she's not trying to be perfect." As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that Catherine's visit had a purpose beyond mere social courtesy. "Harrison, Sophia," she said as they prepared to depart, "I wanted to thank you both. Thank us for setting me free. If you hadn't fallen in love, if you hadn't fought for your happiness, I would still be trapped in a loveless marriage, convincing myself that duty was enough." Catherine looked at William and Elizabeth playing in the garden. "Your children will grow up knowing that love is possible, that happiness is worth fighting for, that people can choose their own destinies. That's a gift my children, when Marcus and I have them, will inherit as well." As the Webbs departed, waving from their carriage, Harrison and Sophia stood together, watching the sun set over their estate. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia asked. "Choosing love over convenience?" "Never." Harrison's answer was immediate and certain. "Sophie, look around us. Look at what we've built." Sophia surveyed their domain, not the grand cold estate Harrison had inherited, but a warm home filled with laughter, a working farm that supported dozens of families, a community that had become a model for others. "William is growing up confident and loved instead of bitter and isolated like I was. Elizabeth will know from birth that she can choose her own path in life. Our tenants prosper instead of merely surviving." Harrison pulled Sophia closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. "And we have something I thought was impossible, a marriage built on genuine partnership instead of obligation, even when we disagree. Especially when we disagree. Sophie, you challenge me to be better than I thought I could be. You make me want to deserve the love you give me." As twilight settled over Blackwood Hall, the sounds of evening filled the air. Crickets chirping, horses nickering in the stables, the distant laughter of children from the tenant cottages. "Harrison," Sophia said softly, "what do you think our story will be remembered for?" "What do you mean?" "When William and Elizabeth are old, when they tell their grandchildren about their parents, what do you hope they'll say?" Harrison considered this, watching their children play in the garden as fireflies began to dance among the flowers. "I hope they'll say we chose love over fear every single day. That we proved happiness is worth fighting for, even when the whole world tries to convince you otherwise. And what else? That we built something lasting, not just a family, but a legacy of believing that people can change their circumstances if they have courage and hope." Sophia smiled, thinking of all the lives they'd touched, Catherine's transformation, their tenants' prosperity, the children who would grow up in their progressive community. "I hope they'll also say we proved that the best love stories aren't perfect. They're persistent." Persistent? We didn't just fall in love once and coast on that feeling forever. We chose each other every day, through difficulties and doubts, and moments when love would have been easier to abandon than to fight for. As the stars began to appear overhead, Harrison and Sophia Blackwood stood together on their veranda. surrounded by the life they'd built through courage, determination, and the radical belief that love was worth any sacrifice. 5 years later, as they watched William teach his younger siblings how to ride horses and saw Elizabeth demonstrate the same fierce independence her mother had shown, they realized their story wasn't ending. It was continuing, passed down through children who would carry forward the lesson that love, when chosen consistently and courageously, could overcome any obstacle. Some love stories end with happily ever after. The best ones end with deliberately ever after, because they understand that true happiness isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to create, protect, and share with others, one brave decision at a time, and that kind of love story never really ends. It just inspires new chapters in the lives of everyone it touches. 15 years later, autumn 1869, the golden October light filtered through the windows of Blackwood Hall's expanded library as Duchess Sophia Blackwood put the finishing touches on her latest manuscript, a comprehensive guide to progressive estate management that had been requested by landowners throughout the South. At 40, Sophia had grown into her role as both Duchess and social reformer with a grace that would have seemed impossible during those desperate early days by the roadside. Her blonde hair now showed threads of silver at the temples, and laugh lines around her crystal blue eyes testified to years of genuine happiness. "Mama, are you almost finished?" 18-year-old William appeared in the doorway, tall and handsome in his university clothes. He had grown into a perfect blend of both parents, his father's aristocratic bearing softened by his mother's warmth and social consciousness. "Almost, darling. How was your first semester at Harvard?" "Enlightening. Professor Adams says my essay on workers' rights legislation was the best he's read from a first-year student." William's green eyes sparkled with the same passionate intelligence that had once driven his father to risk everything for love. "Your father will be proud. Where is Papa?" "In the East Fields with Elizabeth, inspecting the new irrigation system." At 15, Elizabeth Blackwood had inherited her mother's fierce independence and her father's keen intellect. She was currently the only girl in Virginia who insisted on studying engineering alongside her regular lessons, much to the horror of local society matrons. And the twins, Margaret and Thomas, are in the village school teaching the younger children arithmetic. They insisted they were old enough to help, and your father couldn't resist their arguments. At 10 years old, the twins had already shown remarkable aptitude for leadership and an inherited passion for social justice. William settled into the chair across from his mother's desk, his expression growing serious. "Mama, I wanted to talk to you about something." "What's troubling you?" "It's not troubling exactly, it's exciting and terrifying." William's smile was reminiscent of his father's when he was working up courage for something momentous. "There's a girl at Harvard. Well, not at Harvard exactly. She's at Radcliffe College." Sophia felt her heart skip. "A girl?" "A woman, really. Her name is Rebecca Sterling. She's studying medicine. Can you imagine? A woman doctor." William's enthusiasm was infectious. "She's brilliant, beautiful, and she wants to establish clinics for working families who can't afford traditional medical care. She sounds remarkable." "She is. And Mama, I think I'm falling in love with her." Sophia studied her eldest son's face, seeing so much of Harrison in his earnest expression, his determination to build a life based on meaning rather than mere privilege. "And how does Miss Sterling feel about you?" "She thinks I'm an idealistic young man from a privileged background who doesn't understand the real world." William's grin was rueful. "She's not entirely wrong. But I'm hoping to prove that privilege can be used for good and that idealism backed by action can change the world." Before Sophia could respond, the sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the window. Harrison and Elizabeth were returning from the fields, their voices mixing with those of Margaret and Thomas, as the family converged on the house for dinner. "William!" Elizabeth burst through the library doors, her practical riding skirt mud-stained from the day's work. "Papa says you might bring a young lady home for Christmas." "Elizabeth, you weren't supposed to be listening." "I wasn't listening, I was deducing. You had that same expression Papa gets when he talks about Mama." Elizabeth's blue-grey eyes, a perfect blend of both parents, sparkled with mischief. "Besides, Margaret and Thomas already figured it out from your letters." Harrison entered the library, still handsome at 49, despite the silver threading through his dark hair. His green eyes found Sophia's immediately, and the look they shared held all the love, partnership, and shared purpose of 15 years of marriage. "So," Harrison said, settling onto the arm of Sophia's chair and taking her hand, Our eldest son is following family tradition. What tradition is that? 10-year-old Margaret asked, as she and Thomas tumbled into the room, their faces bright with curiosity. Falling in love with remarkable women who challenge him to be better than he thought possible, Sophia answered, smiling at her husband. Will we like her? Thomas wanted to know. If she's brave enough to love William despite his terrible habit of leaving his books everywhere, Elizabeth said pragmatically, then she's already passed the most important test. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, a tradition Harrison and Sophia had maintained despite their elevated status, the conversation flowed from William's romantic prospects to Elizabeth's latest engineering innovations to the twins' plans for expanding the village school. Papa, Margaret said during dessert, when you and Mama were young, did you know you were going to change so many things? Harrison and Sophia exchanged glances. We knew we wanted to build a life together, Harrison said carefully. But we had no idea how that choice would affect so many other people. What do you mean? Thomas asked. Well, Sophia said, when we chose to fight for our love instead of accepting what society expected, we discovered that personal courage can inspire others to make brave choices too. Like Aunt Catherine? Elizabeth asked. Exactly like Aunt Catherine, and like the families who moved to our estate because they knew they'd be treated fairly, and like the other landowners who started treating their workers better because they saw it was possible. So our love story helped other people's love stories. Margaret's romantic 10-year-old heart was clearly captured by this idea. The best love stories do, Harrison confirmed. They prove that happiness is possible, that people can choose their own paths, that love is stronger than fear or convention. Later that night, as Harrison and Sophia walked through their moonlit garden, now expanded to include play areas for children and gathering spaces for community events, they reflected on the legacy they'd built. 15 years, Sophia mused, stopping beside the fountain Harrison had installed when Elizabeth was born. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I was sitting by that creek with baby William, terrified of what the future might hold. And sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Look what we've accomplished. Harrison gestured toward the lights glowing in the tenant cottages, the expanded manor house that had become a center of progressive thought, the thriving community they'd helped create. Do you think we've raised them well? Our children. Sophie, William is studying law so he can fight for workers' rights. Elizabeth wants to build bridges and roads that will connect isolated communities. The twins are already teaching other children and organizing charity drives. Harrison's voice was warm with pride. They're not just well-raised, they're inspired to make the world better. And if William marries his medical student, then we'll have a daughter-in-law who shares our values, and eventually grandchildren who will carry forward the belief that love and service go hand in hand. As they continued their evening walk, they passed the small memorial garden Sophia had created for those who had helped their love story succeed, including a beautiful stone bench dedicated to Father Mackenzie, who had blessed their hand-fasting ceremony with such hope and faith. Harrison, Sophia said softly, what do you want our grandchildren to remember about us? I want them to remember that their grandparents proved love could overcome any obstacle, but only when it was coupled with courage, determination, and a commitment to helping others. And what else? That we showed them happiness isn't something you find, it's something you create, protect, and share with your community. Sophia smiled, thinking of William's letter describing Rebecca Sterling's passion for serving others, Elizabeth's determination to use her engineering skills for public good, the twins' natural leadership in helping those less fortunate. I think, she said, our legacy is already secure. The next morning brought a letter that would test that legacy in the most beautiful way possible. William wrote from Harvard with news that Rebecca Sterling had agreed not only to correspond with him, but to visit Blackwood Hall during Christmas break. Dearest family, Rebecca has agreed to spend the holidays with us, though she warns that she's not easily impressed by wealth or status. She wants to see if our family truly lives by the principles we claim to hold. I told her that's exactly what I was hoping she'd discover. She's particularly interested in meeting Mama, since she's heard about the medical clinics and educational programs you've established, and she wants to discuss with Papa how the estate management model could be applied to urban settings. I think you'll love her. More importantly, I think she'll love you. Your devoted son, William P.S. Elizabeth will be fascinated to know that Rebecca has designed several innovative medical instruments and wants to study engineering applications in medicine. As Sophia finished reading the letter aloud to her family over breakfast, she realized that their story was entering a new chapter. So, Harrison said with a smile, It seems our family is about to grow again. Are you ready for another strong-willed woman with revolutionary ideas? Sophia teased. Darling, I married you, didn't I? I think I can handle whatever Miss Sterling brings to our family. 6 months later, as Sophia stood in the same chapel where she and Harrison had weathered Lord Pemberton's legal assault, she watched their son William marry Rebecca Sterling in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their family's values. Rebecca wore a simple but elegant dress she had sewn herself, carried wildflowers from the estate gardens, and spoke vows she and William had written together, promising not just love, but partnership in building a more just world. The guest list included tenant farmers alongside university professors, former servants who had become family friends alongside traditional aristocrats, and children from the village school alongside the social elite. As Harrison walked William down the aisle, a tradition they'd started when Elizabeth insisted that both parents should give away their children, Sophia felt the deep satisfaction that came from watching love triumph again. But the most perfect moment came during the reception, when 3-year-old Sarah, the newest Blackwood child, born to surprised but delighted parents when Sophia was 38, toddled up to Rebecca with a handful of dandelions. "For the pretty lady who makes Uncle William happy," Sarah announced, with the solemnity of a very young child delivering important news. Rebecca knelt to accept the flowers, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you, sweet Sarah. These are the most beautiful flowers I've ever received." As evening fell and the celebration continued around them, Harrison and Sophia stood together watching their family, their ever-expanding, beautifully complicated, passionately committed family, dance and laugh and plan their next adventures in making the world better. "Sophie," Harrison said softly, "do you remember when we thought our love story was ending by that creek 15 years ago? I remember thinking we had lost everything that mattered. And now?" Sophia looked around at their 5 children, their new daughter-in-law, their community of friends who had become family, their legacy of love that was already inspiring the next generation. "Now I realize that was when our real story was just beginning." As the last dance ended, and the family gathered on the terrace to watch the stars appear over the Blue Ridge Mountains, Sophia understood something profound about love stories. They don't end when the couple gets married. They don't even end when the couple dies. The greatest love stories continue forever, in every life they touch, every heart they inspire, every person who learns from their example that love, real, courageous, committed love, can change the world. One brave choice at a time, one generation at a time, one heart at a time, forever. What do you think of this story? Leave a comment and give it a like if it moved you. Share it so more people can see it.